The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Entrepreneurs play an enormous role in the operation of the market economy, starting new businesses and bringing new products and other innovations into existence. Entrepreneurs take risks and their efforts help produce prosperity. But can entrepreneurship also harm the economy? And how does this illustrate the importance of institutions and the rules of the game in determining whether a nation grows and prospers or remains mired in poverty and sees an economic collapse? Joining me on EconVersations today to talk about the potential for such destructive entrepreneurship in a society is my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. G.P. Manish. Welcome back to the show, G.P.
Thanks, Dan.
So what we want to start with today is we're going to talk, or eventually talk about entrepreneurship and some of its possible destructive forms. But we want to start by distinguishing how it is that economists use the term entrepreneurship and how we might use the term entrepreneurship in day-to-day language, or how we might refer to some individuals, like say Richard Branson as quote an entrepreneur. So let's start. How do we refer sort of generally to entrepreneurship?
Well, for the economists, the broadest definition of an entrepreneur would be anybody who bears uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so we live in a world which is uncertain. We all have to deal with that uncertainty. We have to do things today without knowing for sure whether, what the outcomes of our actions will be. So in that way, a consumer is an entrepreneur. You buy a product, you might not know, you might anticipate some utility or satisfaction from it, you might not get it.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, when we talk more specifically, when we use the word entrepreneur, we refer to those individuals who make the all-important production decisions.
Mm-hmm.
What to produce, how to produce it, where to produce it, the ones who start firms, who start new businesses, who expand existing businesses. Those are really what economists would call entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
Those individuals, of course, bear uncertainty, just like all of us, but they do it in a way where they're allocating the existing resources towards trying to satisfy the needs of other people.
Okay. And so then when we think about these gentlemen like Richard Branson or Sergey Brin, how would they fit into this then?
Well, they're uncertainty bearers like all of us. They do things today, anticipating an uncertain future. But someone like a Branson would be what an economist would call, when we use entrepreneur in developing our theories or our models, he's the sort of individual we have in mind, someone who allocates, who takes resources and uses them in a way that earns a profit.
Mm-hmm.
But in the process, he is taking resources from a place where the value of those resources to consumer is lower, and allocating them to a place where value to consumers is higher. And that's how he earns that profit.
Mm-hmm. So, but not everyone who's, as we get into the economics of this, not everyone who, like, say, starts a business is, from an economic perspective, is going to be viewed necessarily as an entrepreneur, right?
Yes. I mean, there's also people who start businesses and who fail.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, in one way they would be entrepreneurs, but in a different way they would not necessarily be creating value.
Mm-hmm.
And adding value. But that does not necessarily take away from their economic function.
So let's get into some of the economic theory of entrepreneurship, because for economists who view the economy as a market, especially the market as a process,
yes,
entrepreneurship is a really important portion of this story, and it's a part of the story that's not necessarily very prominent in a lot of mainstream or standard economic models. So let's talk about a couple of these gentlemen who've helped us understand the role that entrepreneurs play in economics. So, You or I are familiar with their
Yes.
pictures, but let's tell us a little about these two gentlemen.
The gentleman on the left is Joseph Schumpeter. He's most famous, of course, he contributed to many areas of economics, but he's known most importantly for characterizing the entrepreneur as one who engages in creative destruction. So the one who rattles existing markets, does something different, throws the economy onto a new path. On the right, the gentleman is Israel Kirchner, and he's known for a lot of, he devoted his entire career literally to exploring the role of the entrepreneur, and his greatest contribution is to view the entrepreneur as someone who discovers new but exploited opportunities in the marketplace. Now, of course, both these economists could be categorized more so Kirchner, but to some extent Schumpeter as well, as part of the Austrian school, a school of economic thought where the entrepreneur plays a huge and very important role. So others who talk heavily about the entrepreneur would be economists like Ludwig von Mises, as well as to some extent Hayek, names that are also pretty famous.
Now, to get into this a little bit more, you mentioned Schumpeter's famous term of creative destruction.
Yes.
And the second half of that term sort of shows, this, one of the impacts of entrepreneurship. When you come up with something new, if it's something new and better, that probably also means that some of the old ways of doing things are going to be made obsolete.
Yes. And that was one aspect of entrepreneurship that Schumpeter focused on a lot. So the entrepreneur is essentially somebody who views, we all find ourselves placed in a given situation. The entrepreneur has the foresight to see how to reallocate these resources in a way that is profitable to him or her, but that is better serves the needs of the consumers. And of course, when they do that, so for example, they discover a new product that they can produce with the existing resources, or a new method of production, or a new market. These things, of course, will disrupt the existing economic patterns of production. They will hurt others because now their products might be less profitable, or might even be rendered obsolete. So that's one aspect of entrepreneurial activity, in that while it is value creating, it might in the short run hurt other competitors, other incumbent entrepreneurs.
Now, Kirchner talked about the role of what he termed alertness as sort of like the essence of the entrepreneurial function. But I mean, I guess I also like to think of it as sort of like creative intelligence that you're applying, because at one level, Kirchner talks about entrepreneurs simply being alert to be able to discover things, or see opportunities in the economy, but also in some ways we're imagining new opportunities as well, right?
That's why only few individuals become successful entrepreneurs. There's a difference, for example, between a Sam Walton and a Bill Gates and me, for example, right? They're able to see and, like you said, imagine a future state of affairs that I or others are unable to, and they're able to take existing resources that are available in their immediate environment and repurpose them, towards this end, or this creating this alternate state of affairs that they believe will yield them a profit. But in the process, they are effectively, taking resources from a less valued use and putting them to a higher valued use. But like you said, of course, imagination, creativity, the ability to deal with that uncertainty is crucial. And some of us have it, some of us don't. And that is integral to the entrepreneurial function.
Many new businesses fail, and fail relatively quickly after they're started. So oftentimes, people come up, think they have an idea for a new product, and it turns out not to be successful. So is that a type of entrepreneurship? And so how should we think about that in terms of whether it's contributing to the economy?
Well, because entrepreneurship deals with uncertainty, there's bound to be failure. Some individuals might believe a future state of affairs will turn around, which will yield them profit, and take resources right now and deploy them for that purpose, but they find that their product doesn't sell as much as they believed, or the price is not the price they can get is too low, and therefore they make a loss. That, of course, is integral and part of any sort of dealing with uncertainty. The role that failure plays, of course, is that it shows other individuals, right, how not to do things. And also it makes it evident that certain ways of using resources in that given moment in time are not profitable. So it plays a very crucial role. Failure plays as crucial a role as success in this whole process.
And I think it's important to emphasize, I mean, at some level you have to try things in the market to be able to learn if consumers really, really want something or don't like something.
Yes, the only way to test your ideas is to, sort of put them out there in the marketplace and see if the consumers like it or don't like it. And sometimes you find that they don't like it. And in fact, most successful entrepreneurs have also, dealt with failure, often in the beginning of their career, but also in the, you can be very successful and then fail because you don't keep up with what others are doing, or because you come up with a new idea that's unprofitable. So there is really, to be a successful entrepreneur over a long span of time requires a lot of consistent creativity and the consistent ability to forecast it more correctly than others.
Now, just one further point I want to emphasize, touch on here is that although in common parlance we also often think of entrepreneurs as starting new firms,
yes,
entrepreneurship could, the way we've been describing it, some of its roles here, occur within an existing firm. So you could think about
yes,
you don't have to start a brand new company to do something entrepreneurial.
Yes, an incumbent businessman is also an entrepreneur. In fact, even keeping an existing business running is an act of entrepreneurship because we have to make that decision every day, literally anew. Should you keep the business or your firm producing the same product? Should you change it? Should you make alterations? If you decide to keep it the same way, that also is entrepreneurship. So it's not just about starting new firms that the entrepreneur does. All of it, all sort of production involving the use of resources involves entrepreneurship.
Now, in the market, when entrepreneurs manage to produce something and make a profit, they're sort of necessarily contributing to a better state, a better economic state.
Yes.
And so in this sense, entrepreneurship almost always is going to make us better off, even if we understand like the inevitable entrepreneurial failures are contributing knowledge about what actually works out there. And so from this standpoint, we see entrepreneurship as almost for sure a beneficial thing for society, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's integral to ensuring that resources flow towards the most highly valued ends that consumers have. And it's integral to innovation, to growth. So it has all these beneficial aspects as long as it's being sort of constrained by market forces, right? So you have to compete with other entrepreneurs in buying your resources and then compete with entrepreneurs in the markets that you sell in. So as long as those conditions stay in place, all the beneficial attributes of entrepreneurship exist.
Now, about 30 years ago, another economist weighed in on this issue of entrepreneurship and offered a new idea or a contribution to this. And there's an economist named William Baumol. And he's a very prolific and well-known economist who contributed in a lot of different areas of microeconomics particularly.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about Professor Baumol.
Well, Professor Baumol passed away just a few months ago this year. He lived to the ripe old age of 95. He was from New York. He got his PhD at the LSE, London School of Economics, and he taught most of, or I believe his entire career at New York University and Princeton. Like you mentioned, he was known for a lot of work he did in various aspects of microeconomics, but he also contributed a lot to growth economics and understanding the process of growth and development. He wrote an influential textbook, I believe, in the 1950s called Economic Dynamics, which sort of is a textbook about growth models. But yes, he also relatively late in his career, he wrote about the topic we're going to talk about, which is classifying different kinds of entrepreneurship.
Yeah, so he introduced this whole idea that entrepreneurship could be unproductive or even destructive.
Yes.
And so that's a very different view of entrepreneurship than what we were talking about with Kirchner and Schumpeter. So what would be an example of either unproductive or destructive entrepreneurship?
Well, a perfect example would be what economists call rent seeking, whereby what the entrepreneur does is he doesn't actually compete in the marketplace. He doesn't try to produce a product and compete in the marketplace. Instead, what he tries to do is sort of try to lobby incumbent politicians and others in order to get a measure, a law, legislation passed that will help boost his profit margins, maybe shutting out competition, for example. That would be an example of what Baumol would call unproductive entrepreneurship.
And there could also be destructive entrepreneurship.
Yes.
And so here we have, he uses the example of Rome engaging in some destructive entrepreneurship.
Yes, this is the picture of Julius Caesar. Destructive entrepreneurship would be, of course, the sort of entrepreneurship that's integral to the making of war, where property is actually destroyed, and there's wealth is actually destroyed. Now, what ties all of these examples together is the understanding of entrepreneurship as something that is just uncertainty bearing, right? So it's not just confined to the marketplace. It exists within governments. It exists within, when generals or like Caesar make decisions about how to deploy their armies. So it is ubiquitous. And therefore, that sort of helps understand Baumol's insight that when you use existing resources and bear uncertainty in certain ways, you actually generate value for your consumers, for other people in society who are the consumers. But sometimes you actually don't create that value because, for example, when you pass a new legislation that shuts out competition, you're actually hurting consumers and other members of society, but that still requires entrepreneurship.
And so one thing that Baumol did with this paper is sort of, I think, unite or bring together some two different strands of literature. One was the entrepreneurship literature that we talked about from Austrian economics, and then also you used the term rent-seeking. But that was the idea of rent-seeking out of the public choice economics literature, right? And Baumol's entrepreneur here could sort of see how the two are tied. There could be a relationship between them.
Yes, the rent-seeking term, of course, comes from Gordon Tullock's classic paper of 1967. And what, like you mentioned, what Baumol did was to say, even to sort of seek these rents, which are essentially artificially created profits that come about through legislation or legislative activities that help incumbent businesses. So for example, if you get people in power to pass a law that says, well, you and only you can produce a certain product that confers a monopoly status on you. You earn more profit than you would if you were competing with others. That's an example of rent seeking. But how Baumol integrated these two strands of literature was through the concept of entrepreneurship. He said, hang on a second, you don't just need entrepreneurship and uncertainty bearing when you produce products on the marketplace. You also have uncertainty when you lobby and use resources to lobby those in power in order to get these beneficial laws or edicts passed in your favor.
And I think you can also see that you've got this like creative intelligence that you're applying in both cases. Whether you're thinking of a military campaign or a new way to lobby government or a new way to design a smartphone.
Absolutely.
In some sense, we're using our creative intelligence to imagine something new that doesn't exist right now, and hope, and under some circumstances, it's something productive and positive. In other cases, it can be destructive.
Right, and in all cases, the individual stands to benefit in a private capacity. So on the market, if you are successful, you earn profits. Similarly, if you're successful in rent seeking and getting favorable legislation, engaging in what we would call crony capitalism, right? You also boost your profit margins. The difference is in how it affects other people in society. What we would call consumers. Right. In the first case, the market entrepreneurship, you actually take resources from a less valued, place. they're used in less valued purposes right now. You use them for more valued purposes. You create value for others in society. But in the rent-seeking or crony capitalist example, you actually don't produce anything that is productive, which is why Baumol called it unproductive, or in fact even destructive entrepreneurship. You destroy or don't create value. You don't use resources in a way as to improve the well-being of others in society. But you still earn a private profit.
And then we also see that self-interest is another thing that's tying this all together.
Yes.
Entrepreneurs are assumed to be self-interested,
Yes.
and their goal is to try to earn some profit.
Yes, they would like more money as compared to less, and they try, given an existing state of affairs, to choose the most profitable venture. But again, like you said, there's creative intelligence in trying to figure out whether a certain lobbying initiative would work. Who do you lobby? Do you think that would succeed? Who are the kind of individuals you have to deal with? Do you think you can muster enough support for that legislation to pass through the whatever structure of government you have in whichever country you have? So all of that requires, like you mentioned, this creative intelligence where you have to be able to foresee an uncertain future, but be able to think, okay, it's worth deploying resources today to bring that about.
I think another thing that I find kind of interesting of Baumol's contribution is that allows us in the idea that there's something entrepreneurial, and as we mentioned, the discovery element of
Yes.
entrepreneurship. It allows us to understand how sometimes laws, when they get passed, end up having some unanticipated consequences, because what you actually have are people acting entrepreneurially in using these laws in different fashions, right?
Well, yes. I mean, again, because the passing of those laws helps those who lobby for it. But the unanticipated consequences occur because of how it harms others. So, for example, if you get a certain law that confers monopoly status on you for producing a certain product, you get more profits. But that means others who could potentially have entered the industry are stopped from doing that. Now, the difference between what Schumpeter would call creative destruction and this sort of consequences of your actions is that the creative destruction process occurs as a part of this value creating process.
Right.
But here, you're of course harming other people, in not being able to compete with you potentially, but that doesn't benefit consumers. Right. If anything, it affects them negatively, because now they'll have to pay a higher price for this product that you've artificially created a monopoly for.
Well, and then I think there's also the curious thing of, some years ago we passed like the RICO, Racketeer Influenced
Yes.
Corrupt Organizations Act, and then asset forfeiture laws to help make it easier for prosecutors to go after people like Don Corleone, organized crime.
Right.
But what we've seen is these laws get used a lot of times against organizations we wouldn't think are anything close to
Yes.
the mafia.
Yep.
And again, this is part of this element of discovery, that prosecutors are using these laws in unanticipated fashions, and they're unanticipated because of the discovery.
Yes, and absolutely. This is a different example where you don't necessarily get a new legislation passed, but you use an existing legislation to favor your own, yourself. Another example would be antitrust law, which is again passed so that you ostensibly don't have monopolies emerging in the marketplace, but often is used by one competitor, right, in order to shut out competition,
Exactly.
inverting the purpose of the law. And that can happen as well, where you take existing legislation and craft it, for your own private gain. But also in that case, you hurt the consumer.
Well, we've touched on this issue. Probably the biggest question that economics addresses is the question of why it is that some nations are rich and some nations are poor. And we've alluded to the rules of the game, but Baumol's work allows us to see in other ways in which the rules of the game, or the institutions that we have in society, really are very significant, because it's going to affect what entrepreneurs are going to do, whether they engage in these productive or unproductive activities, right?
Yes, and Baumol's in many ways it's very insightful in order to understand that most important question, about why are some countries poor, some countries rich. Some economic historians and development economists have said, well, in the poorer parts of the world or the developing parts of the world, people don't have that creative intelligence. They don't have that entrepreneurial urge. But of course, I'm from India, for example, and I grew up seeing a lot of entrepreneurship around me. There are hawkers, there are people on the street, right? Every second person seems to be doing something very entrepreneurial. Often the entrepreneurship involves getting around existing laws. But Baumol's great insight was to say, hang on a second, it's not like there's a problem with the sort of supply or the stock of this entrepreneurial ability. It's about how it's allocated. So in countries where there are regulations and rules that hamper productive entrepreneurship, you instead get a lot of unproductive entrepreneurship, destructive entrepreneurship, or really in many ways the unproductive entrepreneurship could also include sort of small scale businesses which aren't as value creating as larger scale businesses because of certain existing laws and regulations.
Exactly.
Like street hawkers who cannot open up a new big restaurant because of certain laws that stop them from doing that. But on the other hand, you have when that same entrepreneurial energy is focused in facilitating productive entrepreneurship, you will have growth. So the question isn't so much, how do we foster entrepreneurship for Baumol? It's about how do you channel the existing creative energy that exists in any given society.
Well, and you talk about having the rules in place, or you put regulations in place, and I think that's an important part because it can affect us here in the United States, and that is when we put regulations like, say, pharmaceutical regulation or patent laws in effect, it's going to affect how entrepreneurs act in these industries, and whether they're going to be coming up with things that are going to be contributing new products that contribute to prosperity, or simply ways to get around regulations or ways to use the regulations to their advantage when they're not necessarily producing something new, right?
Yes, and Baumol's research or his paper, his ideas point to the importance of institutions, what economists call institutions, or if you wish to use another phrase, rules of the game, right? How are the existing sort of, how do you incentivize private property, private entrepreneurship in the marketplace, or on the other hand, you stifle it. And like you said, that is a universal proposition. So it's not like a developed country like the United States or even Western Europe. They're not immune from the creation of what Baumol would call unproductive or destructive entrepreneurship. So changes in any institutional setup can create those same issues. In the case of many developing countries, of course, the existing institutions are so poor that they've hampered and never allowed, growth to occur at all. But in the developed countries, you've had that process. But if you now put in a lot of regulations, that can lead to a stagnation and maybe even retrogression.
Well, and I think it's really crucial because in the United States we've been suffering from a growth slowdown, especially we failed to get 3% growth in any year recently. And at the same time, if you have regulations in place, then you have the people who are in charge of companies, and you have to ask, are they? We certainly know they're trying to be creative and using their intelligence to profit.
Right.
But exactly what are they doing?
Right. Are they going to be trying to create value for consumers, or are they going to be trying to navigate the existing system of regulations or seek new regulations in order to gain profit in that way? And that over time can stifle growth in a very significant manner.
Well, thanks very much for coming on and talking about this. I think it's been really fascinating. I think these are really important issues about just how economies function in generally, and our current dilemma with low growth here in the United States. So thanks for coming on and joining us.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
And thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.